At this point in time, I have to accept, for better or worse, that I am an elder lemon. There is more sand at the bottom of my egg or lifetimer than on the top. Not even AI or transhumanism can radically alter that flow of sand. I will not intersect with the longevity escape velocity curve. I am, after all, mortal. There is a real need to address the festering question of a personal archive, now more than ever. Given that I exist in the lower leagues of photography, if at all, there is still a legacy of work. What might be its excavation now in addressing a small legacy? What of its future? These few words will hopefully land with a younger audience too. A supplication to pay a little more attention to the archive that you may not realize you're creating. The concept of an archive at this time in your life is like considering a pension. But trust me, it is worth considering, somewhat like sunscreen, and certainly before you become a citrus fruit. It might even, if you're really lucky, become a pension. For a good number of years now, even before the situation I explore in the small extract from a body of work that came together as Lugo Lament 170523 for this exhibition, I had started to reflect, dwell, ponder on the notion of existing or not existing. Not just in an elder lemon existential crisis of the self, but rather on my uncertainty of existence related to the images I had made, was making, and might perhaps make. On one level, this is an inevitable and natural consequence of the digital world. Don't worry, this is not going to be one of those analog good, digital bad sermons. Both have inherent qualities and issues. But the fact is that, unlike analog, the digital negative or source file has this strange presence and absence. Its only material presence is perhaps the hard drive it is stored on. And while that can be touched, felt, or dropped, the actual source of the image cannot be handled in a tactile way. It is always a latent, Schrödinger-like image, floating for most of its suspended life in a latent, Schrödinger-like archive. One hopes that these files are tardigrades in relation to future technologies, but one never knows. These days, we all have intentional and non-intentional archives, visual and non-visual, images or data or both, some being updated literally with each heartbeat. For the latter, think of your Fitbit, your internet search history, or perhaps Alexa's recordings in your home because you haven't turned off that option. Surveillance capitalism, as it is known. Facebook, Instagram and the camera phone create somewhat intentional archives of daily existence that most probably don't really consider in terms of longevity. There is a dichotomy of thinking that they will always be there, and yet accepting that they can also disappear at the whim of a provider, or that there will always be an image to replace rather than formally and securely archived. I remember a former teaching colleague once trying to urge his young daughter, several years ago, to back up her digital photographs and videos. And her answer sits as probably a universal sentiment among non-image makers. Why? I can always take more. In fact, this was often said to me by non-image makers after the substantial hit to my archive as a result of the flood. You can always take more. I came to photography in my early 20s through a gnawing existential sense of the ephemeral, transient nature of existence. Big stuff, eh? They give birth to stride of a grave, the light gleams an instant, then it's night once more. Bloody hell. I wanted to get through this thing once without referencing Sam. Anyway, can't be helped. Perhaps it was the medium's meditation on time, life and death that was the rhizome for my future self. I have to say I'm very pleased with this new metaphor. It is the first time I have employed it, having come to me as I wrote this. A rhizome is a modified subterranean plant stem that sends roots and shoots from its nodes, and the shoots grow upwards from dark to light. That's a life in photography. That is the way I photograph, the way I approach photography. Perhaps more so now, but it has always been that way. My attempts at a successful day. As it happens, a quick bit of academic research, old Google and not AI, has revealed to me that a rhizome is also a concept in post-structuralism, describing an assemblage that allows connections between any of its constituent elements, regardless of any predefined ordering, structure, or entry point. This too, as it happens, is very apt for how I try to work with photography. It is also perhaps a good description of a breathing, organic archive. But as promised, no academic stuff. It's not my forte anyway. Deleuze will no doubt be mentioned by others. The notion, desire, or more accurately the hunger, though perhaps naive, to leave a tangible trace of existence in my wake pecked away at my psyche. I needed a trace that could and would exist physically outside of myself, then and in the future. For a lot of people, this is often resolved through having children. But at that point, as of even now, I didn't see that in my timeline. Photography, and in particular analog image making that I began with, in terms of both negative and print, provided some relief to that angst, both in the making and the accumulation. They were my chrysalids, my scattering of breadcrumbs as the clock advanced, a soothing balm against ephemerality. Most photographers have a collector's gene, but usually of the street market rather than the auction house. We are inherently multifaceted archivists of sorts. Like many photographers, I have collections of objets trouvés, found photographs, negatives, scrawled messages, shopping lists, drawings, and even at one point, pieces of string. I also try to keep mementos of big and small life events. I am a custodian of small blips of my timeline. I think my collecting arises from the very notion that perhaps made me align with photography as a creative practice, i.e. a trace of the real. In going to Lugo, I had made a significant edit of these personal artifacts. My science notebook from secondary school, my hair cuttings as I turned grey, my first year UCD timetable, some primary school exercise books, my football and running medals, particularly the one that I won in Butlins when I was sick from sunstroke, or when we finally won the road leagues. They all made the cut. Nostalgia was permitted in these extraneous, non-photographic items. My archive was, and is, always subject to different criteria, particularly when revisiting it. Photographic archives are often contaminated by nostalgia, and this results in the images often getting lost and moribund in a time that has passed, rather than being an image that is living and breathing in and of itself. No nostalgia allowed is the mantra I incant when revisiting older images I have made. The image must primarily work within its framing, aesthetic and intention, whatever that may entail. Naturally, my aesthetic and critical assessment for making this colder judgment has evolved. It is organic, but always nostalgia. When one is starting to make photographs, to make projects or bodies of work, most of us never think that we are creating archives that operate on many levels: social, political, personal, and even historical. I have been in large part quite an imperfect archivist. Having left the field of synthetic organic chemistry, where everything needs to be written down and recorded, in order to often facilitate discovery by serendipity, when it came to making analog photographs, the serendipity of the image was enough. Most of the time I didn't annotate. I probably thought I would somehow always remember. If I feel it's necessary now to fix images somewhat along a timeline that I am unsure of, I will often use a version of sometime in the, so for example, in the body of work before, during, after, almost, a lot of images were moored as sometime in the early 90s. It's a liberating fudge and a reasonable anchor for the image. It also frees the image from overtly specific readings, which can be a handicap for photographs as images in and of themselves. The renowned Japanese photographer Araki, at one point, worked with analog cameras that imprinted the date onto the negative, thereby fixing the image firmly in time, particularly as the printed image would display this data. In order to subvert this, he would alter the setting in the camera so as to fictionalize the timeline. He has stated that this allowed him to switch the past with the future. But he was also liberating his images from the inherent documentary nature of photography and subverting one of photography's supposed central tenets of being truthful. It similarly allowed him to fictionalize his own existence, or more concisely, the narrative of his own existence. It's possible too that in becoming an unreliable witness, he revealed greater truths. But that perhaps is one for a synod of cardinals. This archival annotation for future reference is a moot point when working digitally. Metadata invisibly covers most bases unseen and effortlessly. But one could, too, to some extent, play the Araki game here too. It might even align conceptually within our post-truth world. Obviously, with certain bodies of work, like my long-term engagement with the searches for the disappeared, having the background documentation in terms of an archive is essential, whether or not you decide to foreground it. In this, research journals and their subsequent storage can be an effective measure. So too can a simple box file, or even a labelled shoebox. Another excuse I would proffer for my lack of archival annotation back then was that my concerns, my hunger, my promiscuity, if you like, were, and to some extent continue to be, about the next image. Somewhat like Araki, my desire to trap or fix experience was paramount. Stopping for those few seconds to write down stuff was an obstacle to forging ahead. I also liked the idea of carrying everything inside me to deepen the connection and for ready access. I wanted to be my own hard drive. With the passage of many years, I do accept that perhaps a blunt pencil is better than a bad memory. On their own, photographs are unreliable umbilical cords to the past and arrows into the future. But let me return to my recent crisis of existing and not existing. My lower league status in photography and my diminishing grains of sand no doubt exacerbated this turbulence. Even the tangible had become a crisis of existence, deeper than the invisibility of a digital archive. It extended to those negatives, prints and transparencies that can be touched, felt, scratched, or as would be, in this case, drowned. When I would occasionally pick up a box of prints, even basic work prints, there was and is this nagging, conflicting sense that its content would only ever exist largely in my head, as flashbacks of experiences and memories. Even though I felt they had a value as images, and even a potential financial value, the physical content would probably end up in a skip. Often, when going through a box of prints that have never been shown, that are not on my website, that exist but don't exist, there is a sense of lost time for these images more than for myself, a wistfulness. An archive is a burden and a comfort blanket. Yes, I have made all this work, nearly 40 years of it now. Some of it is reasonable, some of it is quite coherent, some preciously incoherent. But now there is a duty of care. I really want to be a feckless dad, rootless, constantly moving forward, but I have these offspring that I need to nurture and protect, no matter how imperfect they are. I want them to have a future beyond me and the bin man. This perhaps became more pressing when, for the first time, around 2019 or maybe 2020, alas, my imperfect memory, I gathered it together and shipped almost all of it from Ireland to Lugo in the north of Italy. I would join it later. And then 170523. It felt like, and still does, that a part of my sentient memory has been wiped clean by water. Dirty, muddy, cruel water that came across the fields, leaving its trace and dissolving others. It was more of an earthquake than a flood, if that makes sense. Its aftershock still reverberates. Thanks to Gogo's efforts, not everything was drowned or destroyed. What remained, though, after the water departed some days later was a wounded, truncated archive. My archive is now a limping dog. There are so many things wrapped up in the loss of certain works that I may never be able to fully discuss. Particularly that of my work both with and of Gogo, Miss G. This cuts truly deeper on a personal level. The destruction of the entire set of negatives and contact sheets from innocent landscapes and subsequent revisits. 10 years of work rendered unusable as an archive of looking is beyond words. I have some scans, but the loss of that complete record of visual exploration, of good and bad photographs, is enormous. The cruelty of the disappearing again was torturous. I haven't and will not, if at all possible, dump that destroyed archive. I will use it in some form going forward. I have already rephotographed the at times indecipherable, abstracted contact sheets. They have a solemn beauty that speaks to their origins. Even now, 2 years on, I am uncertain of the totality of loss. Such is the lingering sense of dislocation and uprootedness. I could show you a picture of the pile outside the house that the Comune here collected and buried. But that would not get inside the disappearance itself. It would not even begin. This photograph would fail. So many negatives no longer exist. So many prints no longer exist. So many transparencies no longer exist. They are phantom limbs in my memory. Many negatives and slides dissolved completely as I tried to rescue them over the days and weeks. Others, with their small, pollock-like streaks and scratches, were retained on aesthetic impulse, but an aesthetic nonetheless. I kept those that looked, shall we say, interesting. Some days these excited me and perversely gave optimism. Some days they just felt like ruins or graves. They were imposter surrogates for those now gone. It seems inappropriate to use the word rescued for those that were retrieved from the water in an altered state. With their wounds and amputated memories, these survivors exist now as newly created negatives, prints and slides. They are new images, evoking and possessing a strange, terrible beauty. It is both appalling and alluring. These disfigured moments, once an anchor to the past, are now an arrow to an alternative future. A personal history subject to a post-alluvial revisionism, with ruptured timelines from having been reconfigured as new contact sheets. And yet there exists a new body of work, a trace of the real for sure, an addition to the archive. The flood created unwanted gaps in my narrative, but another narrative has emerged. I detest toxic optimism. You know, the sort of positivity to find rainbows in disasters as a way of avoiding the reality that sometimes things can be truly terrible. It would be too much in the manner of a TED-like conclusion to say Phoenix-like, but Lugo Lament exists, as do 3 or 4 other bodies of work from that event. My attempt at healing, my further attempts at a successful day. These add and extend to an archive of a life in photography, The irony that this lament is an extract from an unforeseen and unintended archive is not lost on me. An archive of memory and loss. As I close, let me remind you that there are now several hundred more grains of sand at the bottom of our egg timers. Our archives, like the beat, go on. I will resist Sam's oft repeated words about going on. There is no going back, only remembering forward. You go on or go under. With a limp, of course.
L'acqua seduce, l'acqua assolve, l'acqua dissolve, l'acqua erode, l'acqua nutre, affoga, sommerge, scorre, l'acqua trascina, l'acqua gorgoglia, l'acqua cancella, l'acqua conforta, l'acqua inganna, distrugge, rinnova, ristora, l'acqua unisce, l'acqua separa, l'acqua benedice, l'acqua accarezza, l'acqua battezza, esonda, incanta, idrata, l'acqua culla, l'acqua pulisce, l'acqua sporca, l'acqua accoglie, l'acqua.